My name is Paul Craney. I'm the executive director of the Fiscal Alliance Foundation. Before I start, I'm going to introduce Isaac Orr, who's one of the authors of the study. And then we're going to go into a speaking arrangement and have questions for media at the end. So, Isaac, if you could take the floor and share with the group what the study's all about today.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. Thanks for having me. My name is Isaac Orr. I'm the Vice President of Research at Always On Energy Research, and today we're going to be talking about the study that we prepared, Alternatives to New England's Affordability Crisis. We're really proud of this work. Really thankful for the coalition for, bringing us in to do it. And essentially what we found is that the more dispatchable resources that you have on your system, the more you are able to meet the peak demand that the ISO New England is projecting. So, with the policies that have been enacted by the six or five of the six New England states that are looking to electrify sectors like home heating and transportation, there's going to be a large increase in the amount of electricity that's needed in order to meet that demand. So, by 2034, we could be looking at in the region a peak demand in the winter that rivals the peak demand in the summer. And by 2050, we could be looking at peak demand that's more than twice as high as the current summer and winter peaks. So we could be looking at 57 gigawatts of peak capacity, and that's mostly to meet the winter heating needs. So you need to have enough capacity in order to meet that. And our study really reflects some of the sentiments echoed by former ISO New England CEO Gordon Van Wheely, where he talked about the importance of having dispatchable power plants in order to meet the winter peak demand because wind, solar, and battery storage are going to present basically the energy demands that you need for a system that's going to be that big for winter heating is going to be more difficult to manage with uh, wind, solar, and battery storage as opposed to clean, firm power like nuclear power or natural gas. So ultimately, what we found is that trying to meet this whole system demand with wind, solar, and battery storage was going to cost $815 billion. And other resource portfolios, like meeting that same demand with nuclear, would cost almost half of that at 415 billion through 2050, which is a savings of almost 400 billion. Having a more, we call it the happy medium scenario, where you have 50% nuclear, 50% natural gas, would cost 196 billion through this time, a $619 billion savings relative to the renewable scenario. And that natural gas, just saying, hey, we're going to electrify these sectors of the economy like transportation and home heating using natural gas would only cost an additional $107 billion through 2050. So you'd save 708. And the big reason for that is the dispatchable resources don't require the same overbuilding and curtailment that you would need for renewables. So ultimately, we found that the meeting this new peak demand with natural gas, nuclear, or natural gas or nuclear, sorry, would require 1.7 times more capacity than New England currently has on its system. And doing that same thing with wind, solar, and battery storage would have a 6.4 times increase in the installed capacity on the system. And that is going to drive costs through the roof. That's why you see such high costs with that wind, solar, and battery storage system. And you're not even able to keep the lights on. We did some reliability modeling and we looked at annual fluctuations, so yearly fluctuations in that hourly generation from wind and solar resources. And some years you'd be able to meet your peak demand in the winter, and other years you wouldn't. So the main takeaways from the study are if you go with nuclear power, you're going to be getting similar emissions reduction as wind, solar, and batteries for a fraction of the cost and without the reliability problems that you could see depending on weather conditions with those intermittent resources. And then natural gas, obviously, there's going to need to be an increase in pipeline capacity, which may or may not be feasible based on local sentiments about that expansion process. But ultimately, that would be the lowest cost way to meet this new peak demand. So I'm happy to take other questions at the end of this conference call if people have more details that they want to dig into.
Thank you, Isaac. The next person that's going to be speaking is Drew Klein from the Josiah Bartlett Center in New Hampshire.
All right, thanks, Paul. So I'm Drew Klein, president of the Josiah Bartlett Center. We're New Hampshire's free market think tank. I think it's important to put this in sort of a broader political context, right? So affordability is the number one political issue in the United States right now as we head into 2026. Any New England politician who wants to actually make substantial progress on affordability really needs to read this report. Electricity prices are a top contributor to New England's high cost of living. In building enough energy generation to meet the region's needs in 2050, our report shows that energy prices would increase by 64.8% in the nuclear scenario, 26.5% in that happy medium scenario, and just 13% in the natural gas scenario. These increases are just a fraction of the renewable scenario outlined in our previous report, which found that prices would increase by 126%. Also important to note New Hampshire's contributions. So importantly, this report did not calculate the cost savings to New Hampshire residents by our state's continued reliance on natural gas. By building a network of energy generation already focused on nuclear and natural gas, New Hampshire has kept its own costs lower than they otherwise would be, but also kept costs lower for the entire region. Remember, New Hampshire generates a lot more power than it consumes. We generate on the average, I think the range is about 150 to 170% of the power we need. This report shows that if the rest of New England adopted New Hampshire's approach, the entire region would save hundreds of billions of dollars, avoid dangerous energy shortages, and still make progress on emissions reductions. Now, our previous report found that New Hampshire's lack of electrification mandates for transportation and home heating reduced the projected peak system demand from 57 gigawatts to 52.5 gigawatts. Our lack of those mandates saves, in our previous report, estimates, saves New Englanders about $56.5 billion. So we see that building energy generation based on reliable, low cost power or lower cost power really does get New England where it needs to be and addresses that affordability issue. And I want to end with pointing out over the last few decades that New Hampshire was really a political pariah in New England for pursuing a reality-based energy policy focused on reliability and affordability, rather than a fantasy-based energy policy focused on lowering global greenhouse gas emissions. Political and media leaders from around the region boasted that their policies were virtuous and New Hampshire's were selfish and immoral. But in the last few years, we've started to see a shift. We're seeing a lot of blue state governors deal with this affordability issue by opening the door back up to natural gas pipelines and nuclear. So I think it's clear that New Hampshire has been vindicated in its approach to energy production over the last couple of decades. And this report, I think, really leans into that vindication of New Hampshire for focusing on reliability and affordability and making sure that our customers, our residents, are safe, that they can actually survive a winter without losing power in those peak periods, and that power that's generated here is as affordable as it can be. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Paul.
Thank you, Drew. Greg Moore, also located in New Hampshire, is going to touch on New Hampshire next.
Thank you, Paul. My name is Greg Moore. I'm a regional director with Americans for Prosperity, based out of New Hampshire. And just building off of what Drew said, Drew made a number of phenomenal points. I think it's critical that New Hampshire has gone its own direction, and it's because we see how our future is going forward. One of the things that this report doesn't consider is the impact of things like huge new demand on things like data centers and things like that, which potentially might not be an option in New England. We might fall behind from a competitiveness standpoint. And while a number of folks might be okay with that across the region, New Hampshire is not okay with that. New Hampshire continues to want to be the most competitive. We call it the New Hampshire advantage for a reason. And we're taking the steps to try to make sure that we are not continuously tied to partners who have really expensive tastes that are driving up our costs. Just last year, we passed two important pieces of legislation. One, which allowed for the creation of private grids, meaning you can create a grid that is outside of ISO New England, generating your own electricity and powering your own facilities or powering your own communities. That's number one. Secondly, we passed a second bill, a bill that actually says that our Department of Energy is tasked with identifying ways to potentially have the state of New Hampshire leave ISO New England. In other words, leave behind our expensive partners. And ultimately, that could be a situation that could be really problematic for the rest of New England if we took our surplus electricity and left. I'd say that we're in a strange point right now. Right now, New Hampshire and dealing with the rest of New England, we're in marriage counseling. But if the rest of New England continues down this pathway, we could be looking at divorce. And ultimately, we don't want to go down that pathway. But if our neighbors can't can't come to their senses and actually deliver affordable, reliable power, we're going to have to do things on our own, just the way New Hampshire has always done it. This is a case where New Hampshire rugged individualism might turn its back on the warmth of collectivism.
Thank you, Greg. Well said. My name is Paul Craney. I'm the Executive Director of the Fiscal Alliance Foundation. We're based in Massachusetts. We're a 501(c)(3) organization. We primarily conduct studies, polling, and some litigation that are mostly educational in nature and to help the public. We've done a series of studies on energy issues, and we're very proud to team up with our colleagues in New England to release a study today. It will be found on our website, fiscalalliancefoundation.org, after this press conference. The previous study that was mentioned is also on our website. That was released November of 2024. But I want to draw some attention to Massachusetts here for a minute. We are a big fish in a small pond, and the actions we take have a negative consequences to everyone else, as Greg was mentioning. So this is found in the study. This should be page 34. For those of you that have a copy of the study, you can turn to it, and it shows the actual cost for these different scenarios we mentioned and the Massachusetts obligation. So you can see right here for the renewable, which is driven by the climate mandate of net zero by 2050, it's about $405 billion. That's roughly half of the entire cost for New England. And you can scroll down, you can see Massachusetts under the nuclear program, $206 billion. The compromise of natural gas and nuclear, $97 billion. And if Massachusetts were just to pursue a natural gas alternative, you're talking about $53 billion from now to 2050. And again, 53 compared to 405, and that's the path we're already now legally bound to. So it shows some actual cost for Massachusetts and how it can really tilt the scale for New England. The second page, hopefully you can all see the screen I'm sharing. Can you guys see it? I should ask that. Okay,
Yep.
good. Thank you. The second page, there's only 3 pages. I just wanted to draw your attention to is the ISO New England grid for how much energy has to be produced under these scenarios. So this is the scenario that we're currently legislated to take. This one right here, the renewable, this is the net zero. So the reason why we're producing so much more power is obviously because it's low density, weather dependent energy that has a lot of land needs for this production. But this is what we could be choosing down here, these other scenarios. These are viable options. But Massachusetts legislators, legislative leaders, and then the governor have mandated us into this scenario. Now, doing this scenario obviously also has another big harm, which is just the environmental impact, the land use requirements, just changing people's lives. And in Massachusetts, we are seeing that right now with industrial battery facilities getting proposed in all sorts of areas around the state. People are now waking up to these land use issues, these environmental impacts. But this is our future if we continue down this path. And that's on page 38. The last one I want to show is on page 40 of the study. It's just the costs. We've talked a lot about costs, and here it is again. These are the costs versus the net zero mandate. This is a lot of money. This is a lot of money ratepayers could be saving if state house leaders in Massachusetts decide to start saving its ratepayers some money. So now we have costs for all these different scenarios, and legislative leaders are going to have to explain themselves because now we actually have some costs. So with that said, the Fiscal Alliance Foundation, we're going to use this data all throughout this year. What we're trying to do is now show the bookends for the energy debate of net zero versus other realistic, feasible alternatives that wouldn't disrupt our way of life. So I'm going to hand it now to our friends in Maine. Harris from the Maine Policy Institute, and we'll keep on going through this presser.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. My name is Harris Van Pate. I'm a policy analyst at the Maine Policy Institute, specializing in legal and public policy. NPI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works to expand individual liberty and economic freedom in Maine. And Maine Policy Institute is the strongest voice in Augusta for taxpayers and believes in an open, transparent, and accountable state government. Our analysis, the analysis our coalition released today makes it very clear that New England's current energy policy trajectory is completely unsustainable for ratepayers in the region. State and regional decarbonization mandates, particularly those that force reliance on wind, solar, and battery storage, are projected to impose enormous costs on families and businesses across the region. The reality is that New England ratepayers are already feeling the consequences of a lot of these policy choices, except for those in New Hampshire. And the new report shows that these costs will grow dramatically in the coming decades. The analysis shows that complying with existing renewable and electrification mandates could cost New England electricity customers over 800 billion, that's billion with a B, through the year 2050, which would be more than doubling electricity bills for the average households. These aren't just abstract projections, they're already hitting with heavy financial pressure on families and businesses throughout Maine and the rest of New England. What's especially troubling is that these massive cost increases aren't inescapable. The report shows that alternative energy portfolios focused on reliable, dispatchable energy, natural gas, nuclear power, or even a more balanced, renewable, inclusive portfolio could meet the rising electricity demand at a fraction of the cost that the region's current energy trajectory would levy on the occupants of the region, while still reducing emissions and avoiding rolling blackouts. For Maine, these findings should be a serious warning. Our state has already seen energy subsidies and mandates drive up electricity costs with limited benefits to show for it. Continuing down this path will further burden Maine households, small businesses, and energy-intensive industries. New England should reconsider its current approach and refocus energy policy on affordability, reliability, and realism. By prioritizing reliable, dispatchable power sources and re-examining costly renewable mandates, our region has an opportunity to protect ratepayers and serve as a model for the rest of the country and other parts of the country that are facing energy affordability crises. Thank you all for coming today, and I'd be happy to answer any Maine-related questions you have at the end.
Thank you, Harris. The next speaker is Mike Stenhouse from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Paul. Mike Stenhouse here with the Rhode Island Center for Freedom and Prosperity, Rhode Island's only conservative and free market advocacy organization. It's clearly evident that, and it should be to Ocean State lawmakers, that while they tried to put together a sustainable energy strategy for our state, what they've really done is put us on a path towards an unsustainable and very expensive energy future. The reports our group has put out recently have documented, as many of my colleagues have just mentioned, the staggering costs and the risks to implement this alternative energy strategy, both in our state and in our region. And it's going to cause significant, really significant increases to our already sky-high electricity prices. But you know what? It gets even worse. And I'm going to take an angle that hasn't been discussed yet. A significant portion of those costs, that $815 billion across the region, the $58 billion in Rhode Island, they were originally planned to be subsidized by the federal government. But now, under the Trump administration, at least for the next 3 to 7 years, many of those subsidies are gone. So, in essence, that's going to put even higher burden on the people of our state, of our region, and it just makes the whole act on climate obsolete. You know, those mandates, those are our environmental laws in this state. Those laws were enacted in 2021 under the Biden administration and under Democrat control of Congress. But now it's all reversed 180 degrees with Republicans controlling the White House, the regulatory levers, and Congress. And again, the Act on Climate was developed in a totally different environment than we have right now. So what was already a grossly expensive and hard to achieve set of laws has now become impossible for our state and other states to be able to go it alone without those federal subsidies. So it's just another reason why we have to change paths. And as one of our colleagues said, I know affordability is the key issue, of great concern to so many families. This reversal in the federal government, and if we stay and we don't reverse path, it's just not sustainable for us. They even our own energy commission in the state understands and recognizes the change in federal law, but they say we should keep going with the alternative energy agenda without saying how it's going to be paid for. This is suicide for our state. So today, I challenge the special Senate Act on Climate Commission. Really is our only chance to reverse course. I challenge them and its chairman, Senator Zurier, to recommend a fundamental pivot to what we now know is an unachievable, dangerous, and exceedingly unaffordable climate change agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. Our next speaker is going to be from Connecticut, Yankee Institute. Jack, you're up.
Thank you, Paul. Jack De Oliveira, Director of Policy at the Yankee Institute. Yankee Institute, we help ensure that Connecticut is more affordable, livable, and workable for everybody. And I appreciate the opportunity to add the Connecticut perspective to this regional discussion. So for Connecticut, the key message for this study is that energy affordability and reliability deserve equal weight with the emissions goals. Right now, households and employers are facing some of the highest energy prices in the country, and the modeling in this report shows that those pressures increase substantially under the renewables only approach. So under the renewables scenario, Connecticut ratepayers would face roughly $175 billion in cumulative costs by 2050, second only to Massachusetts and the New England states. Those costs show up monthly in household bills and higher prices for goods and services, and in challenges for energy-intensive employers, which are trying to remain competitive in our region. One reason why Connecticut's situation differs from some of our neighboring states is that we already have a significant source of carbon-free, around-the-clock energy generation in place. With the existing nuclear capacity that we have, it helps moderate emissions and reliability risks, particularly during the winter months that my colleagues have spoken about, when intermediate resources are least predictable. So this study does not really argue that any type of technology is a solution. Instead, it really shows that systems, which include all firm, dispatchable generation, whether that's nuclear, natural gas, or a combination, tend to perform better on cost and reliability than the systems that are just dominated by intermediate resources alone. So for Connecticut, the happy medium scenario is especially instructive. It demonstrates that pairing existing clean baseload resources with flexible generation can achieve meaningful emission reductions while avoiding the sharp increases that we see just under the renewable scenario alone. So for Connecticut families and employers, the most important outcome for us is not the label that's attached to the energy source, but whether the system delivers affordable and reliable power year after year. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Jack. And closing out will be Ross Connolly from Americans for Prosperity.
Thank you, Paul, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this press conference. My name is Ross Connolly. I'm the Northeast Regional Director with Americans for Prosperity Foundation, and we were happy to be part of this study, just like we were happy to join the coalition for the 2024 study, which that 2024 study clearly showed the impracticality of the current plans of 5 of the New England states, New Hampshire excluded, and how that would result in doubling of energy prices, rolling blackouts, plus an $800 billion plus tax price tag on those plans. This study shows that it doesn't have to be that way, that there's alternatives out there that lawmakers and policymakers across the region should look at as pathways to provide a positive energy future for New England residents. I'll just point out our sister organization, Americans for Prosperity, just last week released a survey of 500 high propensity voters from across the political spectrum in the state of Vermont that showed that energy costs are a top concern among 86% of voters. It's hard to get 86% of voters to agree if it's sunny outside today, but 86% of voters have this as a top concern. We are seeing some of the highest rising energy rates in the country across New England. And it is no secret or of how this occurred. This is a government created crisis. It is not this way across the country. Yes, inflation has been a problem across the country, but it is especially high in New England because of the plans that these New England politicians have put forward. We're entering the 250th anniversary of the creation of our country. And I think it's an important time to consider, what do we want New England to look like for the 300th anniversary of the United States? Do we want a future that is contingent of rolling blackouts, doubling of costs, and energy poverty for the most vulnerable among us? Or do we want one of well-being, abundance, and opportunity? As Greg previously mentioned, if we want to be leaders in the world going forward, as New England has always been, with technology, with ideas in the biotech space, we have to be forefront in developing not just a plan to keep the current state of energy, but to have one that is much more abundant, so that we can have those leaders be based right here in New England. And to do that, we see those alternatives in this study of the path to get there, whether it's nuclear, whether it's natural gas, a mix of the two. We have to diversify our energy portfolio so that New Englanders have a positive future to look forward to.
Thank you, Ross. At this point, I realize we're running a little late. I want to open up to questions from the media. If you're media, please unmute yourself and ask a question. If you're not media, we ask that you just refrain at this point. So if you're media, also direct your question to the appropriate person.
My name's Mike Urban. I have a question. I'm a YouTuber and I guess local journalist here. In terms of the waste created by nuclear, I didn't see anything in the report. I mean, of course, I just skimmed over it. I didn't see anything in the report regarding any kind of nuclear waste. Could somebody, I don't know who to point this question to, but I'm wondering, I'm trying to mitigate risks for the taxpayers here, or questions that they may have. So what will we do with the waste that's produced by the nuclear?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that question. Thanks for your question, Mike. So nuclear waste is safely stored on site at power plants throughout the country. This idea that we need to have a localized repository, or a centralized repository rather, in like Yucca Mountain, it's kind of a misnomer. So, I mean, all of the fuel that's been used, and a lot of people call it slightly used fuel, because something like 90 to 95% of the energy that's contained in those fuel rods is still available for recycling at a later time. We just need to develop that technology. So essentially, what happens is they're stored in concrete casks and they're monitored, and that's how we manage the waste at this point.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
Okay. Could I ask one more question? So the other question that I have is, there's really been no small nuclear reactors that have been built successfully in the United States. Do you have vendors and people that you're already working with that are, kind of on the bleeding edge of this technology that would be willing to, install this in Massachusetts?
Well, we don't work for nuclear companies, and we don't necessarily
Right.
like contract with vendors. So that's not really what we're doing. What we said is, by the mid 2030s, maybe these things are viable in some
Mhm.
sort of way to where they can, or honestly, we modeled large nuclear reactors because those are, in our opinion, going to be more realistic moving forward. But,
Mhm.
these are the same assumptions that ISO New England is making when they're looking at alternative scenarios to, this policy or that policy. So We feel really good about those assumptions. We're not necessarily guaranteeing that steel could be in the ground or the plant could be operating. That's going to remain to be seen. But I mean, it's a good question.
Hmm.
Thank you,
Okay,
Mike.
thank you.
I'm going to go to Michael Graham because I know Michael Graham's a reporter. Kevin, you both have your hand up. Can you please put your media outlet name by your name? That would be very helpful. Michael, the floor is yours.
Yeah, and so just for question, we had a new poll at NH Journal. I guess we published yesterday that showed that while by a 20-point margin, people in New Hampshire want lower costs over green policy, it also found that overwhelmingly they hold utility companies responsible for the rates, not public policy. So if the people who are fighting you on public policy are able to hide behind, oh, it's those evil utility companies, can you win this fight? And how much of a is there a strategy to get around that argument that, hey, it's not us, it's not Martha, it's not the governor of Massachusetts, it's mean old Eversource or whoever?
Michael, that is a great question. That's always something that is kind of debated. I know in Massachusetts, I think the feeling is that these policies are driving up costs. I think it's evident in Governor Healy's position on this issue. For 8 years as Attorney General and 3 years as governor, she has proudly said she stopped pipelines. People's bills went up, and now she says she didn't stop pipelines. She said no, she did stop pipelines because it wasn't a good deal. She doesn't know how to answer that question anymore. But the point is, I think the blame is being derived to politicians, at least in Massachusetts, and ultimately the goal is in these other states that they all realize it's the politicians driving up these costs, not the utilities. So,
I can take a crack at that too. So, this is the one of the reasons why think tanks exist and why all of our organizations exist is to do the research and show our work and show what's really driving these price increases and cost increases. So, here at the Josiah Bartlett Center, we did that work on housing policy. When we started our housing policy work back in 2019, 2020, 2021, most people thought it was greedy developers who were causing our housing shortage. We Through our reporting, through research, we showed that it was actually local land use regulations that were driving those cost increases for the most part. And over time, through getting to the media and talking to them and walking everybody through this, we were able to bring about a pretty broad consensus, even among the general public, who now understands there's a really strong connection between your local land use regulations and your housing costs. So the same thing has to be done on energy. We have to keep doing the research and keep talking to media and talking to reporters and calling out the politicians when they try to demagogue the issue and scapegoat energy companies.
And
all right, I want to keep.
if I
Okay.
can just jump in real quick, Paul, to Michael's question, I'll just say there is a great test case for your question right here in New England. The state of Vermont went to the extreme on their mandates and agenda of one size fits all energy plans. And in the 2024 election, it was very clear how voters felt and who they blamed for the energy crisis in the state of Vermont. It was one of the largest election swings in 40 years. The people who voted for those policies, the majority who voted for those policies, lost their supermajority. So I think, obviously connecting the dots to voters of how these policies are impacting them. But voters are smart and they can see the energy bills that are arriving in their mailboxes. I've seen it on X over the past month of ratepayers in Massachusetts, shocked by the amount their bills are increasing. It tends to put the blame on politicians who have created that situation.
If I could
All right, we're going to go to.
add one last point to that, Paul. A lot of this has to do with transparency. One of the things we've done in New Hampshire is we've broken out on people's electric bills exactly what the various components of those charges are. I suspect that states that want the blame to fall on electric companies, you will see them do everything they can to obfuscate those costs.
All right. Thank you, guys. We're going to keep moving. We have 3 reporters for questions. Kevin Mooney from Daily Signal, then the other Kevin, then Amanda from the Globe. Kevin Mooney, what's your question?
Oh, hi, thanks. Yeah, my question is directed mostly to Mike Stenhouse, but anybody else too. I'm wondering how the uncertainty of offshore wind might move policymakers. The Trump administration announced the rationale of citing national security as a reason not to double down on offshore wind. I know there's some legal back and forth with Revolution Wind in Connecticut and I think Rhode Island too. But I'm just wondering how offshore wind might figure into the equation with political figures who might be willing to look at your plan.
Well, I had the chairman of the Special Senate Energy Act on Climate Commission as my guest on my podcast just Monday. And I asked him that very question. Now, as you may know, the federal court yesterday turned back on the the wind farm project. So it's been off, it's been on, it's been off, it's on again. Who knows where it's going to be in the future? But you're right. The key word there is uncertainty. The federal government is changing its policies away from what was the case in 2021 when our climate laws were passed. Even this Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council says we're going to have to pivot because of the uncertainty created by the shifting and reversed federal landscape. So certainly offshore wind, Kevin, is one major concern. It's the largest piece of energy that our state is relying on. And it just, while some of those credits might not be going away, certainly a lot of the other alternative energy subsidies and credits are going away, such as electric vehicle subsidies and infrastructure costs, payments and all that. So the whole thing is up in the air, which is why this report lays out better alternatives than the one we're on. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you,
Thanks
Mike.
very much.
Kevin, from Just the News, you have a question.
Hi, yeah. I wanted to ask, it's regularly reported that wind and solar are the cheapest form of energy. Your analysis coming to a very different conclusion. I'm wondering what kind of costs did you guys include in your analysis that are, for example, not included in like Lazard's levelized cost of energy?
Yeah, I'll grab that one. So we look at a whole bunch of things that Lazard does not look at, like transmission costs, backup costs for generators. Lazard is starting to look at kind of a firming system cost, but they're not looking at it from a decarbonization perspective. They're looking at it from a providing power to a single wind turbine. So essentially, that's the overbuilding and curtailment cost in the system. And I do want to just kind of say up front that the cost that we represent in our always on levelized cost of energy in the report are the cost of meeting this specific system in the future. And that's important for people to know because the cost of wind and solar in our report is very high because they're being asked to do something, which is meet peak demand during the winter peaks, which they are not very good at. So that's why you have such a high amount of cost and storage associated with that. Whereas for the nuclear scenarios and the natural gas scenarios, you have very low cost energy because you can kind of build out your capacity to fit the reliable capacity to fit your demand with a reserve margin, obviously, but you don't have to have this massive overbuilding and curtailment that really drives costs in the later years and the higher CO2 reduction mandates of the portfolios that we examined.
Great answer, Isaac. Amanda from the Globe, you have a question?
Hi, yeah, I wanted to ask about natural gas and how what assumptions the study is making when it comes to natural gas pricing, sort of looking to the future. Obviously, we all saw in sort of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, natural gas prices peaked, and New England is obviously reliant on importing natural gas, and so to some degree subject to just the volatility of those global markets. So in your modeling, and I'm just curious how you're sort of accounting for some of that.
Yeah, we did two price sensitivities for natural gas, and one of them assumes an average cost of $3 per million British thermal units, which was consistent with what the ISO had seen historically. And then we did another sensitivity, which was nearly $5 per million BTU. So that'd be $4.90. And we also accounted for the increase in turbine cost right now. So with AI really increasing the demand for natural gas power plants, the capital cost of a natural gas plant went from about $800 to $900 per kilowatt to almost $2,200 per kilowatt on an installed capacity basis. That's for a combined cycle plant. So when we did that analysis, if you look at figure 24 in the report, we basically said, okay, what if gas is almost $5? What if we look at this higher cost um, for the turbines? And that increased the cost of the natural gas scenario by about $72 billion, but it's still the lowest cost scenario in that end result. So we wanted to make sure that we had those contingencies baked into the analysis.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Isaac. Any other questions from media? If you have any questions, just unmute yourself. I know we have a few other media people on this call.
I guess I would chime in with a follow-up question for some of the New Hampshire folks on the call. I know the Senate Republicans are talking about a priority in New Hampshire. This session focused on micronuclear. I'm curious if that's something you're following and if you have sort of thoughts on pursuing that kind of technology in the future.
Yeah, there's no question. There's been a lot of interest in trying to adapt our regulatory scheme to the notion of small modular reactors. The House passed legislation last year, sort of landed in the Senate, and the Senate is now looking to move forward with that. It's important to understand that in New Hampshire, our regulatory structure around nuclear was all built around Seabrook plant. So we sort of all the concepts are built around that large traditional at the time nuclear plant, whereas these are obviously a very different model of plant and in terms of the entirety of the regulatory structure. So the state is definitely taking the right steps as far as moving forward. I think one of the first precursors to that, Amanda, was the legislation we passed last year, as I mentioned, that allows for what essentially are private grids. This will get things like, for example, data centers off of the grid that the current ISO New England Fed grid, and thus won't create some of the other concerns that some people are having around things like data centers in terms of the potential impact on other ratepayers. So I think that all of these policies go hand in hand in terms of developing a future that allows us to be competitive going forward and still meets the needs while ultimately doing what we have to do, which we always do, which is adapt and adjust to technology and making sure we're taking those important steps to make sure that our regulatory schemes are matching what actually is the energy future. So I don't know if Drew has more to add to that.
Yeah, I think when you look at the New Hampshire House in particular, but the legislature more generally, our approach has really been interesting in the last few years to innovation in general, technological innovation. So whether it's small modular nuclear reactors or flying cars, New Hampshire is taking the approach of legalize it, create incentives for investors to invest in that technology, and let them know that New Hampshire is a place where they can try out this new technology, where they'll have sort of the groundwork already laid for it. I think that's very important signaling to these industries that New Hampshire is a place where they can come and do business. If every state were to leave up these barriers, that would be a problem for investors in these industries. So New Hampshire, I think, is signaling to investors, hey, you have a future, so keep working on these technologies. We're not going to have them tomorrow, but the point is to lay the groundwork so that we get them eventually.
All right. I know we have Olivia, Sam, and I think Tim Dunn from local media. Do you guys have any questions? I want to be mindful of everyone's time right now.
Hi, yeah, Sam Drysdale from State House News Service in Massachusetts. I just wanted to ask a Massachusetts specific question. There's been a lot of energy legislation here that has to do with lowering energy costs, potentially by removing the green energy mandate, the zero emissions mandate by 2050. I was wondering how you're hoping that this report will impact lawmakers of Durham Beacon Hill.
Good question, Sam. I think what we're trying to do is provide some clarity for costs so lawmakers can actually make decisions based off of costs. When we've released the study in November of 2024 for the climate mandates, we constantly ask Governor Healy, this is what your mandates cost according to our report. What do your numbers show and who do you think should pay for it? And she hasn't responded. In this case today, we're showing the cost of natural gas and nuclear in combo. So now lawmakers can actually have some numbers. Our whole hope is that this mandate becomes a goal, so it's not as rigid and has a lot of flexibility. Right. Tim, Olivia, do you guys have any questions? Otherwise, we're going to try to conclude. Okay, Tim says that was his question in the chat.
Could I ask one more question, Paul?
Sure. You'll be the last question unless Olivia jumps in. Thank you, Mike.
Sure. So in terms of, in this report, you have the cost of repowering, let's say, wind and solar facilities every 20 to 25 years. And then it states that the nuclear has a 60-year service cycle, but it doesn't detail the end-of-life costs for the reactors. Have you done modeling in regards to that at all?
Those are usually baked into the cost equation. And so nuclear is a little
Okay.
bit different than other resources where like they have to internalize those costs of disposal. They're the only energy source that I'm aware of that's required to do that upfront. So that's where the distinction lies.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. The study will be published on our different websites. If you have any follow-up questions from media, feel free to reach out. Thank you for my colleagues in the New England States for joining today.
The Fiscal Alliance Foundation is a nonpartisan, nonprofit 501c3 organization. Visit our website to read more about our alternative energy policy studies, sign up for important email updates, make a tax-deductible contribution, and follow us on social media.